South Korea wants a baby boom, but it's facing a doctor drought where it matters most, the delivery room. So how did we get here? We answer this question up next. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Thursday, August 27th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. Korea is spending billions to encourage more births, yet it's facing a critical shortage of doctors to care for the babies who do arrive. Today, we look at how the country reached this paradox and what it says about South Korea's demographic future. For this, I have Jin Yu-young with the New York Times here in the studio. Yu-young, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I also have writer Colin Marshall with us. Colin, it's great to have you here.
Glad to be back.
Yu-young, your article highlights a striking paradox. Korea wants more babies but lacks the doctors to care for them. Do tell us, how did we get here?
So earlier this summer, I wrote a story about a case in Jeonju where there was a newborn baby, but the baby didn't have enough oxygen and needed immediate care right away. But the problem was there wasn't a neonatal intensive care unit specialist within a close distance. Eventually, the baby had to go to another hospital 30 minutes away, but it was too long. It took too long for the baby to receive treatment that it needed, so unfortunately, it passed away. While this case made headlines in the local news, unfortunately, it's not a one-off case. Stuff like this has been happening in the neonatal sector for years now, and it's come to the point where the Korean Society of Neonatology is calling it near a catastrophe. It's a little bit of a paradox, as right now South Korea has one of the lowest birth rates around the world. And while the government has been actively pushing for more measures for people to have more children, unfortunately right now there's just not enough specialists to take care of these babies. So you can see a paradox where the government wants more children, but there's not enough doctors to take care of them. And the story that I wrote really highlights sort of that juxtaposition between a big need that the country has, but right now there's just not enough medical infrastructure to make sure that they're getting the care that they need.
Right. Colin, from a U.S. perspective then, how unusual is this demographic healthcare mismatch, if you will?
This is certainly more of a Korean story than a U.S. story. And writing for a U.S. audience, there's certain considerations you have to make about how well people are going to understand even how the population is distributed in South Korea and what effect that has on, say, the medical sector. Of course, in the U.S., neonatal intensive care units are concentrated in high population areas, as you would expect them to be. And in general, when there's coverage of how the medical sector is performing or not in the U.S., you do find addressed issues of a relative lack of facilities in, for example, rural areas, where you do get them in urban areas. The same phenomenon happens in Korea, but with the distribution of population, it makes things look a lot starker, of course, than they do in the United States. And I myself, while reading this story, when the story originally came out in the Korean media in July, I think it was, somehow as the father of young children, I find that all stories about bad things happening to kids just come my way, one way or another. And so, you read these and I think, oh, I'm glad our kids were born at a big university hospital where if something went wrong, there would be the facilities to treat them. But at the same time, the infant mortality rate is lower here than it is in the U.S. And so, though it is by the numbers a safer place to have children, I think the way that these stories come out in the Korean media and the way that, because of sometimes the rarity and the way they point to systemic factors, they're more emphasized, it can feel like a more dangerous place.
Yu-young, in your article, you report that the number of residents in the neonatal intensive care unit has fallen by a shocking 94%. What appears to be driving doctors away from this particular field?
So like you mentioned, right now, the pipeline of residents in this field is drying up. Even at some of the biggest hospitals in South Korea, they have 0 residents. So essentially, all of the specialists, the professors, have to fill in the gaps. And when they are even lower staff, they rely on paid doctors or nurse practitioners to fill in the gaps. So my reporting has shown that there are three main reasons that residents and doctors are avoiding this specialty. The first one being litigation risks. So doctors say that as this is a specialty that deals with many life or death cases, in many cases the patients are they're premature, they're as little as 500 grams. That's just the weight of a water bottle, perhaps. It's really life and death cases that they're seeing every day. Therefore, you see more, unfortunately, mortality in these sorts of sectors. Because of that, patients and their families who are furious and heartbroken, understandably so, if a procedure doesn't go according to plan, there's more vulnerability that it'll turn into a litigation. And because of this, doctors fear that if they enter this field, even if they have the best intentions in their hearts, if something doesn't go according to plan and they are faced with a legal suit, they can lose their license, they can be faced with a criminal charge or even go to jail. So that is one major reason. Another is the grueling working conditions. So the neonatal specialty is sort of known to have relentless work hours, and the specialist who I spoke with said that they pulled more all-nighters in their careers than they could even count, and sometimes they would be working 96 to 100 hours a week. And because of this reputation for this sector being so demanding, naturally it drives prospective doctors away. The third thing that they have pointed out is a severe pay imbalance. Doctors say that they're not compensated as much as other more lucrative divisions such as plastic surgery or dermatology, and with the other factors that I mentioned, litigation risks and grueling work conditions, they simply don't feel like the pay is worth it. So my reporting has shown like these are some of the main reasons why the resident pipeline has been drying up.
Right, I see. I wonder, Colin, is this ultimately a healthcare problem, do you think, or a much deeper demographic dilemma?
Well, there are many layers to it. As we also note, there's the ongoing conflict between the medical sector and the government over the matter of how many students, how many med students do you let in? You know, as Yu-young says, is the pipeline available? Can the tracks be opened? Can they not be? How much can the system handle? How many new doctors can the system handle? Can that be changed? These are questions that get fought over with increasing bitterness, again, between the state and between the government and the medical sector. As well, this always comes to, as you say, the underlying demographic problem of the birth rate rising, but still being very low, still being one of the lowest in the world. That's another factor that separates these issues here from in the US, where the birth rate is much higher, still not replacement level, but higher. So you don't get quite so stark a revelation of the consequences. But with the underlying demographic problems, it does seem to some med students or aspiring med students that maybe this particular field of medicine is not one with a bright future. You know, I think back to the first professional, or certainly the first doctor I ever met in Korea when I first came here. And it sounds too perfectly telling to be true, but he was an OBGYN and couldn't make as much money in that field as he did before, as he had been, so he switched to become, yes, a cosmetic surgeon. And I think those days, it was worse in those days. But you know, what with the rise in the birth rate, it can look a little bit more appealing, but I think, you know, even if the birth rate comes up a lot, again, the infrastructure has to be expanded.
Right. Yu-young, keeping in mind the tragic anecdote you shared at the start of our talk, it appears that the shortage of doctors appears particularly severe outside of Seoul. How serious is the regional gap?
So right now, the specialists working in this field are calling the regional gap a disaster. I spoke to a new mother just the other day, and she said she lives in Seoul, but it took 2 hours just to see a specialist. And if that happens in a highly concentrated area like Seoul, you can imagine how much worse the situation would be in a non-metropolitan area. As of now, there are around 200 or so active neonatal specialists across the country, but almost half of them are concentrated in Seoul. And you see regions like Jeju with only 2 specialists, or places like North Gyeongsang province, there's only 1. So some of these doctors have to care to like maybe 35 patients at a single time. And like I mentioned, because the working hours are so grueling. It's really hard for them to be able to give their full focus and energy to all of the patients equally. Another issue is that even if there is a doctor available at a hospital in a rural region, if all of the wards are full, they can't accept new patients. And now these new patients have to find a different hospital to be able to go to. I wrote about this previously in the year. It sort of relates to, there's like a term called emergency ping pong, where emergency patients are being transported from back and forth from hospital to hospital, simply finding a hospital that can take them. Seoul has a little bit of a better transfer system than rural regions. In rural regions, sometimes the only available specialist has no choice but to go in the ambulance with the newborn. But if they are in the ambulance to travel with the newborn, then the patients left back at the ward are left without a doctor. So you can see that the rural areas that are being neglected and avoided, the situation is much more pronounced there. Right now, there are 70 maternity deserts in Korea. So a maternity desert is a term that is given to an area with little or no neonatal access. The fact that there are 70 across the country, you can really see how pronounced that this issue is.
Right, indeed. Colin, I wonder, what lessons can South Korea learn from the UX experience in maintaining essential medical services outside major cities?
Yes, the example is worth studying, the example of the US, although the nature of the countries is so different that I wonder how applicable some of the lessons would be. Of course, in the US, you don't just have one dominant urban center, you have at least 2 or 3. And even so, among the minor urban centers, some of them are the best regarded places for healthcare, whether that it be Houston, for example, or Cleveland. These are places that have made themselves known as specifically healthcare centers. And that is something to consider. You know, can a place not be the center, can it not be a primary urban center, but itself be a center of healthcare? It is possible. The US and certain other countries have shown that it can be. But as well, I mean, if we're thinking of rural service, well, this is an issue of, again, the depopulation that has been much more severe here in Korea than it has been in the US. And in fact, the US has some of the same problems. When you get into seriously low population areas, it is more difficult to serve them medically by their very nature. But I think this is a conversation that keeps arising over and over again. Is it possible to de-Seoulize South Korea? And, you know, we don't have much evidence that it is. Certain efforts have been made with, for example, government services have been moved to Sejong City, not necessarily with the greatest success, but even last year, the year before, KBS put out a documentary about how even residents of farther flung cities remain tethered to Seoul because of needing medical care, because they have to come here, get on the KTX to get certain treatments that they just can't find, even if they live in another major city. So maybe more so than the US, a country like perhaps Germany with more dispersed urban centers would be something to look at. But I think the question of can we build a Seoul-like urban center away from Seoul, that's a little bit too daunting. We might want to look at solutions like one that's been proposed in this sort of ongoing clash between, again, the medical sector and the government, training doctors, admitting medical students. One proposal is to get them trained outside of Seoul, in, if not rural areas, then in other urbanized areas, other cities. And that, I think, could be a step forward in rebuilding or building the infrastructure. Is if a place can be used to train doctors, that's a place that can also treat patients. That's, I think, a first step, a small step, but at least a practicable step they can start with.
Right. Yu-young, over the years, South Korea, it's spent enormous sums of money to try to raise its birth rate. Why haven't these policies, investments, sought to perhaps address the medical infrastructure needed for these babies?
So like you mentioned, the government has poured, I think, several $100 billions over the past few years into trying to reverse the birth rate, which we discussed was one of the lowest in the entire world. Right now, Seoul City, just in itself, has pledged 6.7 trillion won, which is around $4.7 billion, into helping new families have children. Some of these incentives would be subsidized daycare, egg freezing procedures, and even free wedding venues. But unfortunately, what experts have been saying is that the money hasn't really gone to developing medical infrastructure. There's sort of an imbalance in where this money is pooling. They're trying to focus more on family-oriented processes rather than fixing the medical infrastructure. So while it's on paper, it's great they're putting all of this money into helping South Korea's birth rate reverse, it essentially doesn't do much for the medical infrastructure that has been struggling to take care of these newborns. A lot of the experts that I also spoke to said some incentives that are there don't seek to address the actual fundamental problem. It's sort of like a Band-Aid solution, if you will, saying we pledge to we pledge this amount of money into making the system better. But if you look at where the money is actually going, it's not being addressed where the doctors are saying is the root of the problem.
Right, and beyond borders, or broadly speaking, Colin, do you suppose financial incentives alone can actually serve to raise the fertility rate?
It depends on how you interpret the evidence so far, and there are optimistic interpretations and less optimistic interpretations. The optimistic one being perhaps in most countries that have done this, the numbers have not risen as much as policymakers would have liked, but it may be a more long-term project than most policymakers are willing to think about because their terms are somewhat shorter in office. Now, it could be the work of multiple generations, potentially. It could be a matter of getting through a bottleneck of low fertility, coming out the other end, and by definition, those who reproduce, and you can pass that inclination along. That's, again, the optimistic view. A more cautious view is if you look at countries like Singapore or Japan or even China, they too have introduced these programs, Singapore particularly generously, with little to show for it so far. And so you come around to thinking, well, even if the results will be delayed, if this is sort of delayed action cure, maybe the problem is not well enough understood, or maybe the understanding we have of falling birth rates is not really being acted on directly enough. Maybe the problem isn't that not enough money is being given out. Now, I think compared to some other countries, Korea's results have been not terrible, even given that the birth rate is still quite low. But you really have to look at the overall total fertility rate charts to see that it's not the countries that are giving out the most money that have the highest birth rates. It's not countries with the most money or any money to give at all. I mean, you look at some Northern European examples like Finland. I think they've been giving out, they've been fairly generous with money and other benefits for parents since the early 1990s, and they're having some of the worst problems with their birth rate in that part of the world. So it's not unreasonable to come to the conclusion that money is not the problem, which is not the same thing as saying you should take the benefits away. I say that as a parent of young children myself, but this is a multi-factor problem, and I think maybe, yes, the benefits are one thing, but there are other phenomena going on, and those should be kept in mind more clearly.
Right. Here in South Korea, Yu-young, the government is stepping up to address some of the challenges, concerns raised by doctors. What has been the response to these measures?
So in July, the government proposed that they would offer more financial incentives for high-risk deliveries. They would offer more insurance packages against litigation, etc., which seem to address a lot of the qualms that doctors have brought up in recent years. But in the past, offering financial incentives, the government seeked to do so in 2016 and once in 2023. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to attract doctors to this field, and especially in the rural regions. My reporting shows that there are several reasons behind this. Like I said, it's not just a money problem, it's an overall structural problem. So just because you offer doctors a higher salary or more reimbursements if they do high-risk deliveries or procedures, it doesn't mean that their grueling hours gets any less. Because the sector is notorious for being so understaffed and being so demanding, it's not a matter of, we'll pay you $500,000 a year if you come work here, if doctors know they're going to be the only specialist available 24/7, 365 days a year. It doesn't really solve the problem at hand. Also, I mentioned litigation risks earlier on. Doctors feel very strongly that they are sometimes labeled as criminals when they have simply just been doing their jobs to save a life. The insurance plan to sort of bolster their I guess, protections against these litigations are a step forward, they would say, but it is also in and of itself not enough to bring the doctors to this sector. And I guess another thing that they mention is it's not just about the one individual specialist and their individual working conditions, it's the entire infrastructure of the hospitals that they work at. For example, even if there are enough specialists, if there are not enough nurses to support them, or if there's not enough technology or equipment to care for these very small patients, it doesn't really matter if there's a doctor. If the system is not in place, then they still can't treat their patients. So while the government has moved forward and proposing new incentives and new protections for these doctors, I think a lot of them are still saying, while they acknowledge it is a step forward, they still address that it is a bigger structural problem that they're still facing.
All right, so much more to be tackled then. Colin, looking forward, what does South Korea's experience tell us about the economic and social consequences of an aging and shrinking population?
Yeah, so this country it occupies this peculiar position in the perception of the world in that it's both attracted so much respect and admiration, but also is held up as a cautionary example, often in the same breath in the coverage of foreign media. And I think these are not unrelated. This is a country that is shown in recent history that it can solve its problems, certain ones. It can retool itself and its institutions on a very short timeline, if need be, which is not the case in my homeland, the United States. And even on the smallest level, you see examples. I mentioned I have two small kids, and when they were born last year, we chose to go to a hospital, as I say, a big university hospital that only 10 years before or less had a problem with a viral outbreak in their nursery, and like a bunch of babies died. And you wouldn't go there in another country. You would say, like, we're not going to forget that hospital. Like, and they probably might even continue an operation. Here, they turned it around and became one of the best regarded hospitals for having a baby and for a variety of other services as well. And it just brought back to mind, oh, things really can be fixed here. Problems can actually be fixed. So if there is a solution to the kind of birth rate problems, demographic decline that South Korea and other countries are experiencing, if there is a solution, I think this country can execute that solution. But whether it's possible remains to be seen. I think the world will look to Korea as an example, applicable or not, of what can be done to at least ameliorate the problem, if not solve it entirely.
All right, on that cautious note of optimism, we end today's talk. Colin, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Young, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, more babies may be the goal, but without enough doctors to deliver their care, South Korea's baby boom could hit a hard ceiling. That's all from us today. Thank you for watching.